Well, that brings us to our last lesson in this particular series, dealing with the book of 1 Samuel. And this is 35 weeks that we have taught on 1 Samuel. Tonight is 1 Samuel chapter 31. Only 13 verses. There's not very many other chapters, just a couple that are short like this. And this is David's exile, part 12, and this is coming to a close as far as his exile is concerned. And I've told you that when I started this, when he was getting into the exile part, I was going geographical. Well, didn't realize that at the end, he's at Ziklag a lot. And that's while still here, we're at Ziklag. And I really appreciated one commentator's writing on this subject, because when you go back, the initial scene really starts back in chapter 27. And that's where David, if you remember, fled from Saul. And that was in exile part 8. And he fled to Achish. Of course, he and his men end up in Ziklag, a city given to him by the king of the Philistines, in the land of the Philistines. Then in chapter 28, we saw the Philistines gather their armies to fight against Israel. Saul was very fearful and didn't know what to do, so he sought answers from God, but God would not answer him. And instead, he sought answers from a medium to raise the dead, to raise Samuel from the dead. In chapter 29, while the armies are gathering, the narrative tells us about David and his men heading back to Ziklag. And of course, then in chapter 30, when they did return to Ziklag, they found their families and everything that could be taken. But then there's that miraculous recovery of all. And David and his men are back in Ziklag, really kind of busy assessing their situation. Then we get back into chapter 31. Now, the reason why I say a while ago I prefaced this, it was interesting the way that a commentator put this, was because you almost get the idea from the chapters that we're going chronological, but that's not the case. We're getting a view here, we're getting a view there, we're coming back and looking at it again. And he was talking about, with most of us familiar with TV, that oftentimes you'll have someone tell a story, and they'll intertwine the story and show you this piece and then this piece, and they'll intertwine it so that you get a taste of that chronology that's there, but it's not really being told to you chronologically. You have to put it together. So that was a pretty good way of helping out, but we want to get back to the armies of the Israelites and the Philistines, back to a frightened Saul who, if you remember, has heard the doom that awaits him. So we're going to look at the lost battle, verse 1. We're going to look at the last battle, verse 2 through 6. We're going to look at the lost hope, verse 7. The lost head, verses 8 through 9. And then the lost honor, verses 11 through 13. The lost battle. Well, it doesn't take long when we begin to look at this. What does it say? Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fell from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. We are immediately given the sad facts, really without any minute or even imaginative detail of the fight. What are we told? They fought, and Israel lost. That's it. Now, as we progress through this story and the next into 2 Samuel, you'll pick up more events, more details, and they will unfold and give us more information. We can at least know the place of the location of this battle. If you remember, it started out with Israel being camped in Jezreel, and the Philistines not far from there. They were kind of like on two sides of a valley. Now, again, what we see is where they were all camped, and then we can note when and where the battle began. And of course, quickly the Israelites, conceding defeat, are running for their lives. And we take note of the location of their deaths. It really does seem like this battle ends as quickly as it started. And it seems that way too when you start noticing the geographical notations, again, where it started, Jezreel, and then where they died was Gilboa. And that's really very significant because they didn't get to run very far. Jezreel is actually an outcropping of Mount Gilboa. So it's right, they're connected almost together. And if you go back a little bit, Gilboa happens to be where the king of Israel, Saul, had camped. It was away from the actual battle. In 1 Samuel 31 and verse 2, I guess I didn't put that in there, but it's supposed to be, if you, I'll come back to that in a minute. It's 1 Samuel 28 and verse 4, it says, "And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa." So you really kind of get an idea that what was happening was the army, the infantry, the cavalry, and whoever else is down there. Doubtful there's any cavalry, there's any chariots. It's mainly infantry and maybe some men with bows and arrows and slings and such. But they're kind of up in the front area. And it seems like Saul is up above and looking down over the battlefield. So while they're conceding defeat and running to their deaths, where are they running to? They're actually running to where the king was. And all the while, David and his men, we find out later, really are chasing and wiping out the Amalekites. That's kind of at the same time. Because you'll read a little bit, you get a little bit more about this young man that 3 days out and 3 days and all that. Well, you find out that had to happen, so it puts those two battles going on at the same time. So while Saul and his men are getting killed by the Philistines, losing everybody, nearly, that you have David wiping out the Amalekites and losing no one and recovering everything. Quite a difference, quite a contrast. Again, Saul's camp wasn't quite far enough from the battlefront, and his men are now about to suffer extreme losses. They never afforded him any protection. And Saul is involved in running too. So we see in the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchi, Saul's sons. So those are three of the oldest sons that Saul had. Jonathan we know. We don't hear too much about Abinadab or Malchi, but they all die on the battlefield. And the Philistines are being very pointed in their goal. They're going for the kill. They're going for Saul. They know that he's there. They've taken him out. There's one son that isn't mentioned here. And he'll play a prominent part a little bit later in the story. If you might remember Ishbosheth. He's not there. He's not involved. And you'll find out later that he begins to reign over Israel while David rules over Judah. Well, we'll find out that his is a very dramatic ending, but we'll save that for a future study and when we get into 2 Samuel. The Philistines, again, are going directly after Saul. So we see it in verse 3. "And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers." Now, I have to say this. I read a lot I try to get my outline, my discoveries before I go reading lot of other people because I don't want to get influenced. I'm glad I do that sometimes because it's rather obvious some of the differences when I start reading a guy and I'm like, where are you getting that from? That's not in this chapter at all. He's making things up. You're going to find out, and it's really important to look at the details. Notice it says the battle went sore. Now I'm also reading a man that's college educated, teaching in a seminary. And he's teaching that, Saul really didn't die initially here. When you read through this, you're going to see where he fell on the sword. We didn't really die because of what happens later, and another man comes in, and he says, well, look, I've got the crown. No, he was an opportunist, that he grabbed that and took off running when he heard the army coming up. But that guy didn't know squat about what had happened. And the reason why I say that is because what does it say? How does it say Saul died? The archers. Now, that guy said, now see, look what happened. This man, he came up and he tells us the rest of the story. No, he didn't tell you the rest of the story. He was a liar. Because he says that the cavalry and the chariots were chasing hard on Saul. No, they weren't. They were chasing hard on you, and you had to run while you were stealing the king's crown, and that's all that you could get, and you got out of there as quick as you could because you were going to get found out. And who knows what would have happened to you. But that guy lied about what was taking place, and it was a lie that got him killed. Now, here, when you start looking, I couldn't help also think about some of the other stories that we've read about archers and how that you've had men in the Bible who have just pulled their bow back, let go, and where it went, who knows? Well, God's a better shot than any of the skilled archers of man. And it wasn't just one, if you noticed. It was the archers. So I don't know how many times he got hit, but he got hit plenty of times, and he knew that he was done for. He was sore wounded of the archers. He was mortally wounded. He knew it. Now, his mind does not race. Some people will talk about Abimelech. And he also had the same kind of situation to die in battle. But Abimelech died with honor. Saul did not. Mortally wounded, it is the imagination of the imaginary that fills him with fear as to what the enemy might do after he dies. Not just that they might kill him in a bad way, no doubt about that. Look at verse 4. Then said Saul unto his armour-bearer, draw thy sword. And some have made the comment that this was not a request, this was a command by the king. Draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. And they do, in fact, do that. They don't get to thrust him through, but they do abuse him. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. Again, Saul's fear included his imagination of what might happen, how he might die, and what they might do to his body. Now, brethren, I don't care what you do to my body after I'm dead. I'm not there, I don't know about it, and I'm not going to know about it. It really isn't going to matter if you hack it up, if you draw on it, or do whatever you might do. Sadly, though, nothing in this story seems to draw attention to Saul fearing for his soul. He only fears for his body. Now, after reading a lot of different, again, commentaries and writers, you can't tell the story much different because it's all laid out for you. So when you start reading what other people wrote, well, golly, they wrote the same thing I did. How about that? It's because it's the same thing. You're reading the text. But it's amazing, again, he fears only for his body or how even people will imagine him in his death. I don't know the condition of Saul's soul, But I certainly see more that speaks and gives testimony to the fact that he has no real relationship with Jehovah. I don't see it. I don't see that testimony. In fact, if Saul had any relationship with Jehovah, he had long ago fallen into a sad and terrible backslidden state. And like many, even Christians, his heart seems only concerned for this world and not the next. His answer to his concerns are from his armor, towards his armour-bearer. Kill me. He won't do it, so Saul falls upon his own sword by his own hand, and his fear and his fatal perspective is contagious. Because what do we read in the next couple verses? And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, that's why I call this the last battle. And his armor, it wasn't the last battle with the Philistines, but it's the last battle for Saul and his sons and all of his men that same day together. This is a sad conclusion to the life and the death of King Saul. Interesting, when you look at this, pretty much everybody gets wiped out. So how did the news of these events even reach Israel? Well, we can be confident of the accuracy of the record that you and I are reading. How can we be sure of it? Because it's inspired. So whether or not there is anybody alive to give testimony, just like when Moses was writing about creation, no man was there. Moses wrote what God gave him an inspired account of it. Well, same thing here. God gave somebody an inspired accounting of what took place. Now, again, you will later read that there was at least one who escaped death from this scene. Later, again, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, some people give credence to that liar that I was telling you about, but his lies bring him to the point of death. That young Amalekite told David the cavalry and the chariots were hot on Saul's trail. No, they were not. They were hot on his trail. That's why he stole the crown and ran, concocted a story. And I think he did it because he thought he would earn a great reward, and instead it earned him a quick death penalty. The details of this story are still being revealed, and they're still being unfolded. And you'll read more about this as David rises to the throne of a divided kingdom in the next book of 2 Samuel. For now we see how the saga unfolds, and we see the lost hope, or, if you will, even the lost cities. In verse 7, and when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley, and they that were on the other side of Jordan saw, well, they saw, but they didn't come to the aid, they didn't come to the rescue. Isn't that interesting? They saw that the men of Israel fled and that Saul and his sons were dead. They forsook the cities where they were living and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt them. That really is a sign of lost hope. They had no perspective of hope except to flee from the enemy. And really, when you get the picture, they only took what they could carry. And that probably wasn't very much at all. Then we read exactly what Saul feared happened. The worst that he could have imagined was about to take place. But I caution you, because if indeed he was lost, by this time he is already experiencing far worse than what was happening to his body. If he was not saved, he's in hell, and he will remain there permanently. From the lost hope, then we run through verses 8 through 10, and we see the lost head. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. Again, they didn't get very far. This was part of Saul's camp. He was watching, but they didn't get very far away. And now it's time for the Philistines to reap the spoils of war. The Philistines made spoil of everything, even the dead, and whatever they may have on their bodies, they were going down and checking every body for anything valuable. So in their search of things valuable, they found the bodies of Saul, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchi. Word gets back to the leaders and orders are given. And what do we read in verse 9? And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent into the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house, notice this, of their idols and among the people. Let me give you one more verse here and then we'll talk about it a little bit. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Beth Shan. Now, what they were doing was they were taking their glory of their victory, which was Saul and his sons, and they were taking them around to their places of worship, to their idols, or the places of their idolatry. This was their means of publishing their great victory over Saul and the Israelites. The Philistines had defeated Saul's army, the Israelites' army. They have killed the generals, they have killed their king, and they have killed all of his sons. Now they take the body of Saul, headless, armorless, and they fasten it to the wall of Bethshan. It is a reproach to all of Israel and a glorious trophy to the Philistines. What a ghastly trophy it must have been. But there's something interesting. We learn from Chronicles that they paraded his body around to more than just one of their places of idol. One of their temples, more than one of their. They took his head and they attached it, listen to this, to the temple of Dagon. How do I know that? 1 Chronicles chapter 10, 9 and 10. And when they had stripped him, they took his head and his armor and sent into the land of the Philistines round about to carry tidings unto their idols and to the people. They were given their gods the honor, right? They have defeated Jehovah, so they think. And they put his armor in the house of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. What a horrible sight to imagine. And to think how odd it was it really was a joy for the Philistines to take pride in this head of Saul, or even the headless corpse of Saul. But do you remember the temple of Dagon had an important part of our story in earlier chapters of this book? If you remember, Israel had lost a battle to the Philistines, and this is exactly where the Ark of the Covenant was taken. And it was taken to this same temple where the head, the hands, and the feet of their God fell off of their fallen God. That should have been enough right there to tell them their God was nothing. That Jehovah was everything. And yet, what do? Now they bring the head of that king and they must have repaired Dagon. They must have stuck his head and glued it back on. They must have glued the hands and the feet back on and set him back up. But they had to have done that. So in honor of their god Dagon, they brought the head of their enemy, the servant of Jehovah, and nailed it to the wall. Interesting, interesting, interesting. They did not repent from their sin. They did not get the message that Dagon was an idol and nothing more, an idol made of hands. Jehovah was the true God. But news has spread again. And this is such an affront. People hear about it, and that's why we talk about the lost honor. From verse 11 to verse 13. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul. Now Jabesh Gilead is really only a night's journey from Bethshan. So they're not that far apart. Gilead is just north of the Jordan River. That's on the side where the tribes of Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh had collected. And so they're closer to the camps and to the land of the enemy. But it was the first place that Saul acted as a king. It was the very first time that Saul took upon himself the commission as a king and delivered this city and the inhabitants, the men of Jabesh Gilead, from the Ammonites. And that act was remembered. They heard about what had done. Notice verse 12. And all the valiant men rose and went all night. So that's why I say it's only a night's journey. And they, what bravery, went right into the camp, right into the house of Dagon, and they took the body of Saul and the body of his sons from the wall of Beth Shan and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. The act of Saul was the first of his royal heritage, and the valiant men took note of it. This is 40 years later. They were not about to let this loss of honor be their king's final memory. They took it upon themselves to act, and they acted quickly. It took Saul 7 days to gather an army together to deliver them. They did what they did overnight. And what did they do? We already saw. They burnt them there, verse 13, and they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. This is not really a burial of honor. It's a burial of desperation. They burned the clothes and the flesh, and they burned them only until their bones were left. And the only marking of their grave was that tree at Jabesh. More than likely, it was a place where they buried the bones, where they could not be recovered. There was no markings, nothing that would indicate to the enemy that Saul and his sons were there to be dug up again. It wasn't, again, a place of honor, but it was an honor, or I should say an honorable act that they did that showed it so much. Then too, if you notice, it says they fasted 7 days. That fast was not really to honor Saul. It was the demands of the law that said that any man who touched a dead body was unclean for 7 days. In Numbers 19 and 16 it says, whosoever toucheth one that is slain with a sword in the open fields, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. So those men had gone back and captured that body, not only of Saul, but of all of his sons, and they were bodies that were slain with a sword in the open fields, or a dead body, or the bone of a man, and that's what they were doing. They were keeping the law. They had touched the bodies of Saul and his sons and found it worthy of risking not only their lives, but risking their uncleanness for an honorable duty in memory of an honorable act. God had sent them a deliverer, and they would not forget him even if he had forgotten God. They were brave men, and they needed to be, and they do need to be honored in view of the honor that Saul lost that day because of his acts of rebellious disobedience to the direct commands of God. These were honorable men who were the recipients of a gracious act of another, who now sought to be gracious to one who was undeserving of their act of kindness. Even then, they still did honor Saul and his sons in the best way they could, or they did so without consulting or waiting for anyone. But the story's not over. The story continues on in 2 Samuel, and I would feel amiss if we did not continue our study right into 2 Samuel. So that's where we're going next. We're not going to take a break at all. We will continue on the same journey to learn more from David as he rises to reign as the king of Judah and becomes one of the greatest kings of Israel. In this journey, we have covered the birth, the life, and the ministry of Samuel. He was the bridge between the heir of the judges and the heir of the monarchy. He also was one of the greatest prophets of Israel who served during a tumultuous time and served faithfully, even starting a prophet's school. And when he died, you will remember that all of Israel mourned him, and he indeed was greatly missed. We also saw the first king of Israel, who was a humbled man when he first rose to the throne. He served for 40 years, but he was only empowered and gifted for such by God for less than 2 years. We followed him as he compulsively sought to kill the man who God had chosen to replace him. And in fact, we saw how Saul was embarrassed every time God's anointed acted as the true king and he as the criminal. That anointed, of course, was David. He has been and will be at the center of our narrative of our next study. And I hope that you are looking forward to the enthroned king instead of seeing the exiled king. And we will be inspired, I hope, to see our Savior through the life of David and to emulate the faith and practice of this man who was called a man after God's own heart. I pray that's been a blessing to you. Thank you for being patient with me for 35 weeks. I never know how long that's going to go and how long it will take. I could have probably done it a little differently. And after a while, I think that's why I just started going, well, I better just take it chapter by chapter or else I'm never going to get out of this book at all. But to me, it's really been a blessing to go through it, and I always enjoy